All right, we're back. This is the ongoing module of Board Executive Director relationships, roles and relationships. And this lesson is about things that will do damage. So I like to go to the dark side because it warns us about what not to be doing. So I mentioned in the previous lesson that there's one or two or three things that we can mess up as boards, and there was about 100 ways to get board work right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that we can do. The one I mentioned already was the whole idea of boards meddling, and I've used meddling in quotation marks, but this can be intentional or unintentional, but this is really important that we make sure boards understand their roles, executive directors not get involved in the board's work, and that we need to keep board members out. Now, it's a very difficult part of a chairperson's work when this happens. Folks, it is not the executive director's job to say to a meddling board member who's putting their fingers in, you know what, that's my job. It is not the board's, or it's not the executive director's job to be the boss of the board. The reverse is the case. So board behavior that's out of the box is the chairperson's job to manage. Now, if it's a small item, the chairperson is just going to pick up the phone, have a call, meet the person for coffee, have lunch, make this a fairly informal thing and just say, just wanted to clarify that as board members, this is our role. And at our last meeting, identified, I noticed, I saw, I heard, you asked some questions that were actually quite operational in nature. Don't overplay your hand. Make this short and sweet. There's a book called The 1 Minute Manager, and in the book it talks about the 1 minute warning or the 1 minute reprimand. And that's all we're talking about. This is a quick conversation. It's often done by phone. It's a quick face-to-face. It could be done before a board meeting and just say, Mary, can I just chat with you for a second? Make sure it's private, make sure it's sweet and nice and kind, but make sure it's clear that we don't get involved in operations, and that is a board chairperson's job. Now, if the issue is a bigger issue, clearly the board as a whole is going to have to discuss this, and we need then the board to reach consensus or make a motion that says the chair will address the board member who is becoming difficult. Now, the discomforting part, it becomes that we often have to have then a session, a meeting, or a portion of a meeting without that board member present if it's a difficult situation and has really become problematic for the board. And that might mean we have a secret meeting. We don't like to do those, but sometimes in reality, if we have one troublesome board member, the rest of the board has to meet with that person's knowledge, without that person's knowledge. The second one, we've talked about this also, but holding in-camera meetings or in-camera sessions in secret where there are really no serious issues to warrant this type of meeting. Now, I was just doing some work with a nonprofit organization that really had a problem with this. We had a board president who had run amok. I call this the tyranny of one, when any one board member starts to get an upper hand and do some things behind the scenes. Now, in this case, it was complicated because it was the board chair, but what she was managing to do is pull people offside. She was having clandestine meetings. She managed to get 3 or 4 people in her living room one Sunday and spill the beans about how she didn't think the organization was being properly managed. Turns out that this was aided and abetted by a staff member of the organization who didn't like the executive director, didn't feel the executive director was doing her job properly, and then took the initiative to answer the question of the board chair to say, how are things going around here? Like, how, is everybody happy? And right, and clearly this is a board chair that was looking to stir up trouble. I have no opinion when I consult on these situations about the goodness or the badness of the work of the executive director. My interest is in the right process, and clear this was not that. If the board wanted to ask some questions about the executive director's performance, the board had every right to do that. It needed to go to the board as a whole in camera with a performance appraisal or other process used in order to determine and either confirm there was a problem or reassure the board that there wasn't a problem. So clearly this needs to be done very carefully, and I would be very careful, board members, about giving traction or credence to individual staff members who might have an axe to grind. Those issues have an appropriate grievance process. So if a staff member comes to you and asks questions or makes statements about an executive director's performance, the right answer is, if you have a concern, document it and submit it to a grievance or complaint process. And in due course, if it is not resolved, the board will hear your complaint. That usually cuts things off. Now, if you get 3 and 4 and 5 of those, obviously there are some warning signs you need to review, then hold an in-camera session. Those are examples of when the board is doing its job to make sure that it is managing the executive director and supporting the executive director. Those things are reasonable and reasoned causes. Everything else, except for the things that we've already identified in the previous lesson, like making sure we do compensation reviews, making sure we do performance review, report reviews, etc., everything else is off the table in terms of in-camera sessions. And again, if you want to argue with me, just send me a note, Paula MacLean at learningforleaders.ca, and I'm happy to chat with you about that, at least in virtual form through cyberspace. The third thing that can be really something that's not going to help and do damage to the relationship is disengagement by board members, and often caused by or maybe attached to in some way the executive director doing it all. That includes things like board recruitment, planning agenda, board meeting agendas or committee agendas, organizing special events, and taking action and working on achieving the goals of strategic plans. Executive directors are often hired because they are doers, and I can tell you that if executive directors that are watching this, if you decide to do it all, then the problem is you will create a weak board. Your board will not be engaged. It is worth the time and energy that in a very busy day and week, it is worth your time and energy as an executive director. Support your board to learn how to do this. In my book, Great Boards, Plain and Simple, which is the guidebook that follows, that preceded this video course, one of the executive directors that I interviewed for that book, her quote was, "The board is my boss, it's my job to learn to dance with them." And I thought that was very, very important to understand. It's the executive director's job to support the board in learning that dance, and the two in partnership make a huge difference to the success of the organization. Fourth thing on our list is that board members that are allowing employees to vent, and I touched on this, or do an end run past management without following grievance procedures. This isn't just an important thing. And when we give access to the board by unhappy employees, and that can be formal or informal. You can bump into an unhappy employee on the street or in a restaurant or in the course of your other volunteer work or paid employment. If you begin to feed that beast, it just simply grows and it gets very, very ugly. And if there is dissension in the ranks inside the organizations, your trust but verify mechanisms should kick in, and you should find that out. I'll just make a suggestion. If you are doing, for example, employee satisfaction surveys once every 2 years, there's absolutely no reason why you cannot do an employee satisfaction survey every year to attempt to see if there is something valid about those concerns. Do remember that in any organization, whether it has 5 staff or 500 staff, not everyone will be happy. So it's a difficult call on the board to figure out, is this serious and more generalized, or do we have one negative Nelly who has some stuff to say and is trying to get some traction with the board? So it is an okay reason to have an in-camera session to try and figure that out, and by all means use some information gathering, some investigation, some fact checking. If you have some suspicions that something, that the writing is on the wall in some way, it is your job to make sure that you verify good management of the organization. However, don't over-validate the 1 or 2 people that might come in the course of a year or 2 and then, chew on your ear at a, agency fundraising, an organization fundraising event or something like that, or a Christmas dinner, and say, you know what, you're on the board, aren't you? Yeah, well, you know what, we need to have a little chat with you about something, and then they spill the beans, and you can just, you can say right at the get-go, this is not the forum, and this is not the place that I would have this conversation with you. So we have a grievance process, we have a complaint process, and you need to follow that. Board members will not listen to individual staff members who have those kinds of concerns. So your concern may be quite legitimate and valid, but I won't hear it in this format. Right? That's hard to say, but it draws a line in the sand, and it really does help the relationship between the executive director and the board continue to be a positive and strong one. So damaging behaviors from executive director's perspective, withholding information is probably the #1 complaint that I hear from board members about the work and the relationship they have with their executive directors. That they're not transparent, that they feel like there are problems that are being, talked about that maybe the board has some, assistance to bring. So might have some questions or concerns about. And I'm talking about things that are in the governance role of the board. So we're not talking about things that are belonging to management. I'm talking about things that the executive director is withholding. For example, a funder who's getting a little antsy, and we have maybe had a meeting or had a letter or an email that says, we might be doing some review of your funding, or we might be going to recontracting next year, or we might be going to tendering or proposal, reproposing or whatever. And it's really important the executive directors say, this is what I've got. I don't have anything more, but I wanted to let you know. This not only gives the board information, it also creates trust. So it has a double impact that it tells the board what's up, because boards are responsible for financial sustainability. Don't fool yourself. It's not just an EG job. So withholding information is a really damaging way of trying to go about your job if you're an executive director. So if we have something pending, like a lawsuit from a dismissed employee, we don't have to tell the board we're dismissing an employee. That's the executive director's job. It is the executive director's job, however, to monitor the potential liability of that. So the executive director might say to a board meeting, to the executive or to the chair, we are doing a dismissal. We do expect a lawsuit. Wrongful dismissal lawsuits are very, very common in Canada. They are less common because the legislation that drives employment law in the United States is very different than what we have in Canada. Most states in the United States have at-will employment, and cause for dismissal, it doesn't loom nearly as large as it does in Canada. So when we have potential liability exposure, that is part of governance work, and the executive director should share that information and should, in fact, be updating the board on a regular basis as that progresses. If it gets resolved, obviously there will be dancing in the streets. The second thing executive directors do that can cause damage is dominating board meetings and controlling the majority of the board agenda. And that's why I mentioned earlier, it's important that your board chair and executive director work together to create an agenda. In a few organizations that I work with, it's the board executive or the chair and the secretary who create the agenda with some support and input from the executive director. So the executive director should not be doing all the talking, and they should not be creating the agenda all by themselves, because chances are if it's their agenda, then it will be them who's addressing each one of the agenda items. So we also want to make sure that we're not feeding the board a whole bunch of administrivia. I got an email not that long ago from a board member who said, you'll be interested to know, Paula, we watched one of your videos and we did a pushback with our executive director. Exact quote. She said that we have pushed back our executive director because she was dominating our board meetings, creating the agenda and talking about not what we felt as a board we wanted to talk about, but what we really wanted to do was to take back our responsibility to be defining our own agenda, committees reporting back, board members having responsibilities on the board. And the board member that sent the email said initially it was taken as an offense, as a criticism, but a few days later the executive director came back and said, you know what, I'm glad that the board is doing that. I have taken on too much and I shouldn't have, and I'd be happy to support the board in learning how to develop the agenda, and they together will work on something better and more constructive going forward. Now what I want to caution executive directors about is not talking about certain things in board meetings. We don't talk about personnel issues. We don't talk about minor or major facility issues unless they have a capital budget kind of impact. We don't talk about client or participant issues at board meetings unless they relate to liability in some way. So I know many people watching this video will come from smaller communities where in that community you might be the only nonprofit and you might be serving people who are well known in the community for various reasons as the clients of the organization. For example, organizations that serve people with disabilities, often all of the people with disabilities that are served by that organization are known by first and last names, the family is known to board members, etc. So I get that. That's all right. It doesn't belong at a board meeting, and it should not be discussed by board member and executive directors or any staff member and board members. So that is an operational item, and I encourage you to create strong and positive boundaries around that. All right, the third one on the list is failing to provide the board with either internal or external support or facilitation needed for the board to succeed at its work. I'll give you a simple example on this, is that boards that either fail at or flounder at developing things like governance policies or succession planning or strategic planning, it's really sad for me to see that, because with a little bit of money on the table or a little bit of expert volunteer help, you can bring people in who will guide and facilitate the board to get top-notch governance policies, really good strategic plans, and really awesome succession planning. This is tougher parts of board work if you're a volunteer with regular expertise that goes outside the not-for-profit sector. Doesn't matter. You can be a lawyer, you can be a doctor, you can be a chartered accountant, but very often the whole world of governance policies is outside of your skill set. And so this is not something that board members should have to try and muddle around with, waste their volunteer time. Executive director's job is to help the board learn to dance, and it's very important that the executive director finds those external supports or uses the internal supports to be able to give the board guidance. Fourth thing on the ED bad list is being non-responsive, slow, or late with responses to a variety of things. I often get board members telling me that the executive director doesn't answer emails, sometimes for days, sometimes weeks later. And I often say, you know what? If you knew what life as an executive director was like, even in a smaller organization, you do a lot of things in executive directors as executive director of small organizations. Bigger organization executive directors have multiple managers who report to them, but they are still very busy people. So I like to create a code for urgency. We can flag the actual email as urgent. You can follow the email with a text to say, sent you an email, it's urgent. You can send a voicemail instead of an email and say, I'll only call you and leave you a voicemail if it's urgent. And so that helps the executive director triage that. The other thing for executive directors is to make sure that you answer the email in brief fashion and say, I'm at a conference all week, or I'm meeting with funders for the next 2 days, or I'm in a donor meeting, or whatever. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And that helps two ways. First of all, acknowledges receipt, and that can be done very quickly by text or by email from your phone. But it also lets the board member say, I'm not being ignored. I do understand this person is busy. And it helps educate your board members, if you're an ED, to say, you have no idea the speed at which I go. Just for board members' reference points, executive directors often do a full 8, 10, or 12-hour day without going to the bathroom and without having any food, and very often drinking nothing but caffeinated beverages. This is not good, okay? So for those of you that think the executive director kind of sits in their office and goes to a few meetings, that is very not typical of life as an ED. Just remind you that your executive director is probably not ignoring you. If this becomes a performance issue, however, if it comes forward in employee satisfaction surveys or in the 360-degree performance appraisal, that everybody's emails are going unanswered, that text messages are being just falling into a black hole, it is absolutely important that it get addressed. So that becomes the chair of the board's responsibility, typically, to say, you know, I've had several people comment that you are not returning emails, or that your text messages take 3 or 4 days to get back to people. That is an issue that should be discussed, and it's feedback for the executive director to consider in how they manage the communication with their board. So one of the things that also can be a delay point is that the board makes a motion, which is a directive to the executive director, that doesn't get implemented in a timely fashion. I know of a provincial organization, 150 members in various communities, that voted to split 2 parts of their organization, and 6 months later the board was dealing with an issue that said the executive director had not started to move, not even started to move on the separation of the 2 halves of the organization. This was not a good situation, and I was asked in a conference call to kind of do some brainstorming with the board to try and figure out how do we manage that with our executive director. Delays in routine reports, regular financial statements are probably the most common in that. Boards are are responsible for the financial oversight of the organization. So getting behind on financial statements is not a good plan. We all know there are circumstances that might cause a delay. The delay should be one of a few days or a week or two. And the question I would ask as a board member, if they're delayed for longer than that, is what's our backup plan when an executive director or when a finance director falls out of place, or when the person who's doing our bookkeeping is not able to do the statements that month. I would be asking the executive director, what's your backup plan for that to happen? What's your backup plan for your backup of your financial records? Are you keeping them off-site? What's your backup plan for your computer to go down and all of a sudden not be able to do what the board needs it to do? So that's a problem for the executive director, because there needs to be a plan B for all of the potential disasters that might cause this delay. Notwithstanding that, we'll still have occasional hiccups. If it's not chronic, if it's not long, then I would just let it go. Board requests for information, research, analysis on certain areas of importance. As an executive director, it's your job to take that responsibility on if the board gives you a motion or consensus to do it. My encouragement to you is to delegate or hire somebody to do this work if it's a major project. Even if it's a minor project, if you don't have time, rather than delaying doing what the board has asked, send it somewhere else. Give it to someone who might have time, who has some talent or some interest. Contract it out to somebody outside of the organization. It's often worth the effort and the money to be able to do that, to be timely in your response to the board. To the board on this point, I would just say this: watch how many requests of that type that you give to your executive director. There is not a ton of capacity as a rule inside the executive director's current workload to respond to a whole bunch of additional requests for information or research or background checking or doing whatever the board is asking the executive director to do. All right, that's the end of this lesson. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to walk through 3 parts of the Your Turn learning assignment. Again, they're self-explanatory. Work on this through your board. You can do it at your next board meeting. You can do it as an individual assignment. Most of these are conversation-based, so it's probably best that you take a few minutes either right now or at a subsequent meeting to work your way through the assignment. All right, final piece of this module then is that there are a series of detailed charts around the things that belong to each one of the executive director and board of directors. So you'll see this done in chart format, and I have a little 5-step thing about how you use these. So I'm going to walk you through them. They're way too specific to be able to do a video on, but my encouragement to you is, as you work on your board and executive director job descriptions, for example, consult this list. As you build out your board's governance practices, put some of the roles that you see here that seem to resonate for your organization on both the board and the ED side. If you like all of them, by all means, just take these charts from your handout and drop them into your board governance policy as an appendix, as something that might be helpful. You can include them in the board orientation package if you would like as well. So that brings us to the end of the module on board executive director roles and relationships. I hope that this has been helpful to you, and I will remind you that I welcome your comments and your questions to Paula MacLean at learningforleaders.ca. Bye for now. See you in the next module.